Welcome back to the Speedster rebuild. We're going to be assembling the Ruckstell. That's been a project, and we'll try to get underneath the car. So it's been a while since I last uploaded a video. Kind of the world has been flipped upside down, and turns out that the logistics of trying to get in parts has been just really difficult. So what we're going to do is going to go ahead and run down to the antique auto ranch and show you the first steps to rebuilding a Ruckstell, or just rebuilding a differential in general. So let's get down there. All right, so I'm in the process right now of straightening the axle housing. So what I've got here is a truck axle shaft that has been machined true and then ground on the ends, and I have these mandrels. There's an exact copy of this one that goes into the bearing slot or holder for the inner axle bearing, and that shaft then is completely true from the bearing receiving pocket to this bearing receiving pocket. Let's just say the mandrel is in a parallel with the two bearing slots. This sleeve will slide inside the axle housing. So as you can see, we've got a large gap here. So this axle has been bent. And the way that we straighten them out, or at least I straighten them out, and a lot of people around here straighten them out, is we will heat up little spots, get them bright red, and then we will quench them with cold water. And that causes this portion of the axle housing to compress, and it will pull the axle over, or the axle housing over, in alignment with this mandrel. And you do this enough times in various spots on this axle, it will relieve the pressure and it will straighten the axle housing between the two bearing registers. The axle itself isn't trying to go around a curve. Hope that all makes sense. Gonna go back to straightening this axle. All right, here we go. Moment of truth, and boom. The mandrel drops right into the housing. Now we know this axle housing is straight between this bearing boss and this bearing boss, and should make the car roll easier, should reduce on wear. I mean, you saw how bad this thing was bent. I would guess it was real close to about a 1/4 inch bent. And sometimes you find them and they're perfect, and sometimes you find them where they've been run into a stump or a rock or a curb or something. And we've got a mandrel plug that goes into the Ruckstell side of that, and find out if we got a bent Ruckstell housing. Here we have the Ruckstell, and it is straight. There is no reason to heat on this because that mandrel just fits right down inside of there with very little effort. Doesn't deflect the shaft. So we got two good straight axle housings. Time to clean them up and start assembling the Ruckstell differential and put the whole series of parts together and get this thing back underneath the car. Well, this Ruckstell did end up having some water damage. I mean, it was gone through, so it had some new parts in it, like roller bearings, had some new sleeves, had some new seals, gaskets, that sort of stuff. But it was left unattended, obviously with the torque tube up in the air, and there got a little bit of moisture down inside of the Ruckstell assembly. So some parts have got some surface rust, which will need to be just kind of cleaned up, or at least just taken off so it's not going to be hurting anything. So one disappointing thing about this new Ruckstell is that it didn't have a standard ring and pinion set. It had a high-speed ring and pinion set with 3-to-1 gears. Originally they were 363 ratio. And you're thinking, why is a high-speed ring and pinion set a bad deal? Well, it's because this car originally had a Warford in it. So a Warford is a direct, an underdrive, and an overdrive for a Model T. So when you add the high-speed ring and pinion with the overdrive transmission, it's just too tall of gears. Like I mean, even though this thing's got an overhead conversion, it's just too tall. And so we had to make a decision. Do we keep the Ruckstell in there, or do we look for another standard ratio ring and pinion? And ultimately we decided to remove the Warford because it gives us more leg room to get in and out of the car. It's already a tight cockpit. Let's make some more room. So we're going to stick with the high-speed ring and pinion, which this engine should have no problem pushing it. And
get rid of that Warford. Here's our new Ruckstell parts we have over here on this side. That's kind of out of frame. We got a bunch of the old Ruckstell parts. So this was that like surface rust I was talking about. I mean, it's not bad. I'll just have to wire brush it off, get it in the solvent tank, clean off a lot of the residue that's there. But we were fortunate. We've got a good end plate. The old end plate was very, very bad. Brand new bearing. This is like a $150 or more bearing. Like, that's awesome that we got a brand new one of those with the new Ruckstell. And then some other various parts and pieces, things like new Ruckstell triple gears. These in the old one, they were shot like bad. And even this housing in the old one, these holes were all wallered out. Like it was a total mess. So really, we're doing pretty good with good used new parts. And then here's that high speed 3-to-1 ring and pinion. It is brand new. I mean, it's never been actually run. I mean, there's no, the machine marks are still on the face of the gear. So that's pretty awesome. That's a good win. So let's go ahead and start cleaning some of the parts here and get the axles and the differential pumpkin assembly all put together. We're starting off with some pretty simple stuff here. Basically just gonna have to bolt the pertinent things back together again. And that's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Just throw some axle grease there. You can also do it right on the axle itself. Really doesn't matter. This is just wheel bearing grease that I'm sticking on here. Doesn't need to be anything specific. So just basically just little tiny skim coats. We can put on triple gears, just like that. And then between the two axles, there's a fiber washer. So typically a quarter actually costs less than this fiber washer if you were to go buy it. So if you got a quarter in your pocket, got an extra quarter, stick it in there because it's cheaper than the fiber washer. The triple gears are in. There's a sun gear that all those go around. Sun gear, there it is. Sun gear looks like that. And it doesn't have a forward or a back, but it's probably a good idea to put the least worn side, or we'll just say the least worn side, in the upward position, because that interacts with the sliding gear. And if the corners are rounded over too badly, they just kind of machine each other and bad things happen. So slide the sun gear in, and it kind of floats in there. Then the end plate can go on, and it's okay if these pins are a little loose and it isn't clocked any particular manner. Next, we can put the bell on. There's a thrust washer that lives inside the bell. And there's two pins. There's two pins on the inside, so you can see them. Pin there, pin there. They go all the way through, and they locate a thrust washer. Originally, this thrust washer was paper. You can replace it with a steel thrust washer, and it never goes bad. Goes on. Voila. This guy can go on. Then we can put our bearing retainer on. It gets a little bit of assembly lube here on the inside surface. One of the things I highly recommend is, even though this thing's got really nice bolts, and you may think like, oh, well, my ring gear bolts are really good. Ruckstells are notorious for stretching bolts. They're really long, and they're put under quite a bit of torque. Again, they're another like 5/16 National Fine bolt, and so they're fairly low torque, all things considered. But because they're so small in diameter and they have to go through such a large cross section, they often stretch, and there's a lot of torque on this ring gear because the brakes go through the ring gear originally. So it gets a lot of jostling back and forth. So it's really good to make sure that your bolts are good quality, not stretched, because the last thing you want is to have snapped ring gear bolts, because that makes for a really bad day because you can't stop. Turn the axle assembly sideways, and that will allow me to slide my ring gear on. The ring gear doesn't have any particular locating boss other than it just has to line up with the bolt holes. And it's a good idea if your ring gear doesn't pound on, at least with a small tap, you might look for another bell, because it's important that the friction from the ring gear help drive the whole assembly. If your ring gear just slides on, that's no good. And it puts just too much strain on, just puts way too much strain on the ring gear bolts to try to hold the assembly together. You know, we're working with 100-year-old technology, but you want to give it the best chance it's got. And I've seen Ruckstells that have sheared ring gear bolts because that ring gear was not driving through friction on the bell. And there's a washer on each one of those. It's important to have that washer, because that way you're not tearing up this brass thrust plate face when you torque them down. All right, well, the Ruckstell manual says to torque these bolts to 35 pounds. I like to start off and incrementally just bump up to there, just to make sure everything is square, because there is so much length of these bolts. And yes, they are special and they are hardened. It's a good idea to be nice to them. So I'll go ahead and continue torquing these up, and then I'll meet you on the next step. And now we need to install the roller bearing sleeves. So there's 2 sleeves per axle housing, with the exception of the Ruckstell that has a large roller thrust bearing. So it only has 1 sleeve. So the easy way to tell sleeves apart from each other is if they're any of good quality. There are some that were built like in the 70s, probably like Argentina type sleeves that are just garbage. They're really soft, but original sleeves, and then the current ones that are made, I think by Bradley Machine, are good. So the way you can tell a left from a right is if you put the grease hole up, and then whichever way that chevron is pointing is the axle housing side. So this one here points to the left hole, this one here points to the right. This is the right housing, so we're going to go ahead and stick the right one in. There's also a dimple, or at least there should be a dimple. These actually are marked right and left, which is unusual. You know, and I was actually thinking these are pretty good axle roller sleeves. Now inspecting them, the fact that it doesn't have a dimple in it, no bueno. Ain't gonna use that one, that's for sure. So this one here, it goes hole up, points to the right, that's the right side. There's the little dimple. So you got to be careful for some of these, actually you can tell looking at it, the diameter of the sleeve is smaller, so it's all crushed in. So this is one of the bad ones. Be careful for junk stuff that's out there. So this is an original one. It doesn't have any pitting on it. It really feels amazing. It looks good. So one of the things that you need to, just be careful of is they get lips on the thrust side of the sleeve. They also get pitting because there's a lot of pressure that's being put on these roller sleeves. And I've got more to choose from, so we're not out of luck. Well, it's time to install the sleeve, and there's a dimple here that lines up with a receiver inside the axle housing. And you'll find that, man, that is really too big. Well, my trick, and I'm sure a lot of people do it this way, but is to use a hose clamp to compress the sleeve so it fits down in the hole. So what I do is I approximately line up the dimple with the receiver slot, and then I point the driver for the hose clamp in line with the little notch cut out for the pinion, and then I crank it down. Just tighten that guy down until, and it's not uncommon that you'll crank it so that slot is almost all the way closed before the sleeve will fit inside the axle housing. just cranker. There you go. Just like that. Get it lined up. Grab your rubber mallet. Drive her in, and once it's flush with that hose clamp, release the hose clamp. It expands into the hole, and then you'll just tap it in and send it home. That's in. And there it is. Now it's time to take that differential assembly that we put together, and we'll stick it inside of the Ruckstell housing, and at that point then we can take the other housing that we have put the roller sleeve in, and we can slide everything together, and we can do our first test fit for preload on the carrier assembly. We've got a steel plate that lives there. We'll give it a little bit of a assembly lube. This is just a brass thrust washer. Make sure it's got a brass thrust washer. We don't want any of that Babbitt garbage on there because they are no good. This is a used brass thrust washer, so I don't know at this point how much preload we're gonna have on this assembly until everything's clamped together. And I always start with the rear end with no gaskets on any of the surfaces, because I wanna know, how much. And usually what I set for, or what I shoot for, is that with a little bit of tension, I can turn the ring gear with my thumb. Seems kind of like not exact, but it doesn't have to be with this sort of gear setup. Just has to be close enough, essentially. Got the other axle housing here. We're gonna take a little bit of assembly lube and just put it on the face where this steel thrust washer fits, because it needs to defy gravity for just a moment while we pick up this axle housing and slide it over the axle assembly. So this thing goes way up in the air, up on top, past everything, and then we can slide our hand up inside of here, compress the roller bearing rollers, and away we go. So right now we don't have any preload on the ring gear, so it's going to turn pretty easily. So we will start by grabbing a couple of bolts. There's probably some scientific way about how you're going to set preload. I do so much of it just by feel, because I've done so many of them. I know what they should feel like. So right there, it easily spins. You can see that spins very easily. To me, that's just not enough preload put on those thrust washers and that bearing. Now I do happen to have an 8000s bronze shim that we can put underneath one of the steel plates for the bronze thrust bearing. And that might be the right thing to do, but what we don't know is what is our clearance between the crown gear and the pinion. And so to know that, we're gonna have to put together the U-joint assembly and the drive shaft and test fit it on here to confirm that we have the correct amount of backlash or preload. It's not uncommon that these Ruckstell housings will get worn where that roller bearing's at, and we might have to shim the whole carrier assembly up in the housing. Very rarely do we ever need to really shim it away, and especially when we're dealing with these high-speed ring and pinions, there's a lot of monkeying around as far as moving the pinion in and out, up and down, back and forth, to get all the parts right. So we do know that we need to have some more preload. Now we just got to figure out which direction we need it to go. So this might be the ticket, but then again, the driveline might prove otherwise. This may seem kind of silly, but this is kind of one of the most critical parts of the entire differential rebuild process. So in the stock configuration, all of your power is going through this pinion gear. That means all your braking, all of your driving force goes through this pinion gear. And the way that it works is it is on a wedge taper. The Ruckstell Rebuild book put out by the Model T Ford Club of America has some misinformation in it where it says that the nut that goes on here needs to be torqued to 75 foot-pounds. That, my friends, is much, much, much too low. We're talking 150 foot-pounds, not 75 foot-pounds. And if you can even do more than that, do it. Always go to the next hole, never back it off. It's vitally important that there's the correct amount of torque that we're driving on the taper and we're not driving on the pin. So speaking about pins, this woodruff key is not an ordinary off-the-shelf woodruff key. This key is very important because the factory Ford woodruff key is hard. Like a file will not touch it hard. So when you're assembling the drive shaft, make sure you put on the correct woodruff key and you torque that pinion up to 150 foot-pounds dry. We don't want any lubrication on there. We want to make sure that these tapers are dry, dry, dry. And then you're ready to go. So, dry that off with some brake clean. Slide our roller bearing on there. This is brand new roller bearing. This has already got a brand new sleeve put on it. And this has got a brand new thrust bearing. So somebody's been in here at some point in time, which we knew about. So, pinion gear goes on, gets tapped into place. This key here is a little bit tight. And now we put the nut on. And like I say, 150 foot-pounds. So I'm gonna end up taking this out of the vise, sliding it down, because on the opposite end, it's got a square drive, which will clamp into my vise nicely. 150 foot-pounds minimum. And there's a hole that intersects the castellated nut. So my torque wrench only goes up to 150 foot-pounds. So that's what we're gonna go to. And we go till it goes click, click. Lock that baby down. And if something strips, count your blessings that it did it here and not while you're on the road. Because a day without brakes is a bad day. All right, I happen to be right between holes. That means we're going to the next one. We're about 1/16 of a hole. Almost there, a little bit more. All right, if this thing isn't precarious, I don't know what is. So at this point, we've got the drive shaft bolting up to the Ruckstell housing. And what we're going to be checking is the backlash in the gears. So we'll just, I've got the radius rod attached, goes up to the front of where the U-joint is. And I'm going to put in a couple of bolts. You couldn't put in 3, you know, if you really want to make sure it's on there, how it's going to be seated. And then we're going to check how much backlash we've got. So the backlash is going to determine if we need to put in any shims to raise the gear into the pinion, because you can't effectively on these, you can't push the pinion in, you have to bring the ring gear up. And that makes a little bit of pain in the butt. It takes some work to get what you're looking for. So we've got approximately 10 thousandths of backlash there, but we can do better. I mean, all it'd take to have 0 backlash is a 10,000th shim underneath here. Raise that up. See how it feels at the U-joint. Because what we don't want to have is we don't want it to be like clunk, clunk before anything happens. I mean, 10 thousandths, really, that's not bad. But we also don't want it to be like, you know, where the teeth are grinding into each other so much, where they're actually bottoming out on each other. I'm going to try for a little bit better. So, tear this whole thing apart, I'll make a spacer to go underneath here and just shove it up a little bit. But what I did is I went ahead and found a decorative tin and took the lid off, and I cut out a shape that basically mimics this thrust plate. This plate bolts between the bearing and the Ruckstell housing and locks that assembly together. So I shoved it in there, and we have very little end play there. We've got 2 thousandths worth of play, which is perfect, I think. This feels good. It doesn't go lump, 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 lump. It turns freely. That's pretty tight. Yep, I can move it pretty easily with a screwdriver. Thrust washers are where they belong. Okay, the fact that I can move it with a screwdriver pretty easily, and I can move it with my fingers. Okay, so with this thing turning with my fingers, gives it the right amount of preload. With the screwdriver, it turns pretty easily. That's what I mean by feel. I mean, I don't really know how much pressure that is. If I was to guess, maybe there's like 10, 15 pounds of pressure on those bearings. Okay, that should be it. Just turn smoothly, no lumpity lumps, that's good. All right, well that is pretty much all it takes to get a Ruckstell together. I want to say I have roughly about 4 or 5 hours, maybe 6 hours total from complete teardown to rebuild, with some little incidentals here and there. But this thing is ready to be degreased, painted, and then we can stick it underneath the car. The Ruckstell shifts perfectly. I just tested it here off camera, and pretty happy with it all. I think it's gonna serve Charlie really well. So I appreciate you all watching. If you could just go ahead and give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't, and I will catch you on the next one. So take it easy, and good luck. Oh, I bet y'all were like, what's he doing? And I was like, I'm so used to putting together standard differentials. Yeah, when you do a high-speed ring and pinion, you have to put the pinion gear in first. Ding dong.